Let me introduce ourselves. We were all in our early 20s and were colleagues at a de Havilland's aeronautics facility in England. This is the simple galley with a couple of Primus stoves. From London we took the ferry across the English Channel and spent time in Paris obtaining visas. We drove through central France into Spain, which was not a bit like we expected. The terrain and primitive animal-powered agriculture were a real surprise in this part of Europe. In fact, Spain was more like we imagined North Africa to be, and vice versa. We were never very confident of our chances of completing this ambitious journey, so seeing Morocco through binoculars across the Straits of Gibraltar, we said, well, at least we saw Africa. When we crossed the border into Gibraltar, it seemed very odd to see the British flag and policemen wearing pointy hats. The Barbary macaques inhabit the rock, and it is said that so long as they exist on Gibraltar, it will remain under British rule. We loaded the truck onto a ship called the Mons Calpe to carry us across the straits to Tangier. A fast-moving cloud streamed downwind from the top of the rock, but its leading edge dissolved as fast as its trailing edge formed, so the cloud itself stayed in the same place, like a banner flying in the wind. When we arrived, we said, well, at least we set foot in Africa. Morocco was full of surprises too, not least of which was the size of the road signs. Where we had expected to find desert, we encountered huge mountains with running streams bordered by colorful oleanders. Here is Colin with a slab of cork from the bark of a cork tree. The road snaked its way through the mountains with peaks reaching as high as 13,000 feet. On the eve of crossing the Algerian border, we found a quiet spot for a day of make and mend. This is the Algerian border with the truck over an inspection pit. The locals are fighting a vicious war for independence from France, and we had to spend every night in a French army encampment during the mandatory curfew. This is the fuel station kiosk next to a citrus grove. Oran and Algiers were beautiful European-style cities overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. This is Algiers. Mobil had made arrangements for us to take on fuel at their service stations all along our route. After climbing the Atlas Mountains, the truck had lost most of its power, and we stopped in the cold and rainy town of Jelfa, where we removed the cylinder head and ground the exhaust valves, for what turned out to be the first of 5 such occasions. We were now 3,000 feet above sea level and had reached the fringes of the Great Sahara Desert. Only just over 8,000 miles to Cape Town. This is Laguat, founded in the 11th century, its minaret prominent above the town. We now felt safe enough to camp in the desert where the silence was total and absolute, a complete absence of any sound. El Galea is an attractive and well-watered oasis town. The ruined Kasar dates from the 10th century and provides a great vantage point from which to view this extensive oasis. Leaving El Galea, we now headed deep into the heart of the Sahara. Billowing oceans of sand encroached from both sides over the road, which was paved along this stretch. These sands of the Grande Erg Orientale and the Grande Erg Occidentale are continually on the move, and yet have remained in the same area for hundreds of years. Next came the Tadimate Plateau, a flat stony area 200 miles wide. Tire pressures had to be continually adjusted as bone-jarring corrugations caused the tires to get very hot and expand, while the chilly nighttime temperatures caused them to contract again. Any stationary vehicle is always checked by anyone passing to make sure that all is well. Our passage raised huge plumes of dust, which penetrated the interior of the truck and covered everything. We passed a couple of road junctions where, we were told, vehicles still managed to run into one another despite the openness of the terrain. We checked in at Fort Mirabel, a remote French fort over which the tricolor flew. Under the immense bowl of the unencumbered desert sky, glorious sunsets faded to a brilliant canopy of stars under which I slept. At dawn, we could see how abruptly the plateau came to an end, without any warning, and visible from only 100 yards away. All around was clear evidence that the plateau had once been much more extensive. The next oasis town was in Sala, with a population of 43,000. Mud buildings were crowded together as if seeking shelter from the encroaching sand. The camel is the all-important ship of the desert. We came across camel caravans hundreds of miles from the nearest settlements, moving in seemingly slow motion, with the Tuareg leading the string, walking alongside and seldom mounted. By way of contrast, purposeful military trucks swept across the landscape. We followed a steep escarpment for many miles and came across the burnt-out remains of a military jeep, which we later learnt from its crew had caught fire and sprayed exploding ammunition in every direction. The track, referred to as the piste, turned sharply into a cleft in the mountains. This is the Arak Gorge. The small square shape just below the letter A in Arak is a military fort. Here the truck is entering the gorge. The track follows a dried riverbed, and the fort lies just around the bend beneath the castle-like outcrop. It is located at the foot of tall cliffs, littered with falling rocks the size of houses. We crossed the Tropic of Cancer and were now officially in the tropics. The desert lays bare the bones of the landscape. This upended strata extended as far as the eye could see. At the head of the gorge we found ourselves in an area where a surface of fine sand was dotted with natural rock sculptures, set out as if for an art exhibition. Camels picked their way through the rugged terrain, some looking as though they were in need of a good meal. This basalt mountain that looked so close turned out to be 50 miles away. And when we finally reached it, it looked as if the molten lava had just boiled out of the ground and solidified. We now approach the regional centre of Tamanrasset, situated at 4,500 feet above sea level at the base of the Hogar Mountains. It was a pleasant town, with, at that time, the French military and administrators being much in evidence. Among them were local troops with their camels and colourful uniforms. Most of the buildings were constructed of mud. While we were taking on fuel, we were besieged by local Tuareg people looking for a ride. We made a side trip into the heart of the Hogar Mountains, which rise to over 9,000 feet. We followed the rough track and climbed up to the hermitage of Esikrem, which was at 7,700 feet. There is open water in these mountains, and there are even small fish in the pools. We wondered how they got there, because the water has no outlet and simply sinks into the sand when it descends from the mountains. The track was stony and rough. We continued our route south with a couple of passengers we picked up in Tamanrasset. The local costume is very practical and surprisingly comfortable for desert conditions. We had overheating problems and installed a can to catch the water expelled through the filler cap. To control its flow, we improvised a Schrader valve using a piece of wood and a length of hose. The track led first through rocky terrain with occasional bushes. We continued to come across camel caravans, or even single individuals, travelling across this vast and desolate region. One of our Arab passengers was called Gahak Madu. We all shared the same evening meal at the end of a long day of travel. The endless desert stretched out to infinity in every direction and made us feel very insignificant. In some areas, small cairns marked the route, while in others it was clearly defined and well used, producing a heavily corrugated surface which made for an uncomfortable ride in a vehicle like ours. The surface was levelled by the crude but effective method shown here. Further south we encountered soft sand, which gripped the wheels and brought us to a standstill. Getting unstuck often involved digging and placing sand mats in front of the wheels. This is the small oasis of Ingazam, just a few miles from the border with Niger. The sand had drifted almost to the top of the walls. but the well inside them provided welcome water. This is the border with Niger. Once across the border, the route was sometimes a matter of following tire tracks or watching out for marker posts. This was long before the advent of GPS, and it would not have been difficult to go astray. We came across the skeleton of a vehicle which had made it no further, its remains rust-free and nicely polished by the ever-shifting sands. For a while we travelled in company with a Land Rover and a Peugeot 403, also heading south. The first signs that we were reaching the southern limits of the Sahara were clumps of dried grass. And here, the cracked surface was obvious evidence that heavy rain had fallen. Areas like this become completely impassable when wet. We soon began to see real trees, shortly followed by open savanna. This semi-desert region is called the Sahel, and it extends the full width of the African continent. But the track was very rough. We reached the town of Agadez with the prominent minaret of the Grand Mosque, built in 1515 and restored in 1844. Agadez is an important regional centre, and this picture shows a variety of Sahara crossing vehicles. In researching this documentary, I learned that the roads to Agadez were mined in 2009, following a Tuareg rebellion. We encountered interesting rock formations. We began to see more people. The increased vegetation brought forth swarms of locusts which filled the sky with the whirring and rustling of their papery wings. They were thick on the ground and capable of stripping the landscape bare of every blade of vegetation. A flock of vultures descended out of nowhere to feast on roadkill. Soon we began to see people on foot from local villages, and large herds of animals congregated around wells. The water was drawn up in a skin bucket by a sturdy ox ridden by a young boy. The rough road conditions caused real upheaval inside the truck, with gear tossed all around and covered in fine dust. sucked in through a roof hatch which had abandoned ship. We crossed into Nigeria and arrived in Kano, the second largest city with a population of 3.5 million. This is one of the gates to the old town, with its close-packed mud houses. And by way of complete contrast, a magnificent mosque. We were now in sub-Saharan Africa, and the Arab influence gave way to Bantu peoples. Colin caught up on correspondence using the same typewriter he used to create documents required for border crossings. With the confidence that we had made it thus far, we exchanged haircuts, and I painted the names of the places we had visited on the side of the truck. This tiny car had come all the way from Holland via the Ivory Coast. It seemed like we had come a long way, but although we had driven 4,500 miles over the past 2 months, we still had 20,000 to go, and the flavour of the trip was about to become very different as we made our way through the savanna and jungles of the vast African continent. We had our first puncture the day after our spare wheel leapt from the back of the truck and vanished into the African bush. We forded small rivers, and our progress was brought to a halt by a large one, where there was no bridge, no ferry, and many people wore no clothes at all. We had to belly crawl through the mud under the truck to attach the winch cable to extricate ourselves. We encountered joyous groups of dancers along the roads. We crossed large rivers on simple ferries built using multiple boats. We came close to capsizing the truck when the edge of the road gave way. Local passers-by provided cheerful and enthusiastic assistance to get us out. Road conditions presented a variety of interesting challenges. Not all passengers were enthusiastic about boarding the ferry. This ferry took us across the Ubangi River from the Central African Republic to the Belgian Congo. This bridge had to be shared with the railway. We had left the savannah behind and were now in deep, impenetrable jungle. As the darkness closed over us, the night was shattered by a cacophony of terrifying sounds fit to waken the dead. The perpetrator of these alarming shrieks turned out to be a tree hyrax about the size of a small rabbit. Other unusual animals were the okapi, a relative of the giraffe only discovered by science in the 20th century. This strange animal has a tongue 14 inches long, which can lick the top of its head. We met a fellow Englishman who had been travelling on his own for 8 months through the Congo. We continued down the centre of Africa along roads that often doubled as streams. We saw many examples of unusual structures built by termites. In the distance we caught a glimpse of the snow-capped Ruwenzori Mountains, also known as the Mountains of the Moon. Almost all the medical and educational facilities in the Congo were provided by missions such as this magnificent example. The road climbed above the jungle to reveal extensive Belgian-run coffee plantations, such as this one, where we crossed the equator. We suddenly found ourselves looking down on the western branch of the Great Rift Valley. The scene that lay at our feet was part of the Virunga National Park, and through binoculars we could see that the valley floor was richly populated with huge herds of wild animals. We stopped at Goma and continued along the shores of Lake Kivu to Bukavu. We awoke in the morning to see the Nyiragongo volcano steaming gently in the dawn. After leaving Bukavu, we came to a section of one-way road where an African at one end would beat an oil drum, and if he received the okay from his colleague at the other that the road was clear, he would open the barrier to let you proceed. We stopped briefly in Albertville, since renamed Kalimi, on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, and spent Christmas and Boxing Day 1959 high above the lake in an isolated spot with a wonderful view. Major road construction created tough and perilous conditions, especially when it rained. We carried chains for use when conditions warranted. The roads in this area were little more than rough tracks and very slippery. Trees were another hazard, either as obstacles to hit or by toppling across the track. A series of flimsy bridges were the next hazard. Here Colin is going through the motions of checking the rotting timbers. We took turns at the wheel while one guided the driver and the other stood by ready to photograph what seemed like an almost inevitable catastrophe. The termites in this area went into building immense mounds which towered over the truck. At last the roads improved, and after crossing the border into southern Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe, we encountered the twin strip system, which meant driving down the center of the road and swerving to the left when meeting oncoming traffic. At Kitwe we stayed for several days with a couple we had known when working at de Havilland's. Here we were able to visit this huge open-cast mine, employing a mega excavator, and descend 1 kilometer into the bowels of the earth in one of the company's underground mines. continued on to the town of Livingston and the magnificent Victoria Falls, which the Africans call Mosi Artunya, translated as the smoke that thunders. The falls are more than twice the height of those at Niagara. Livingston is believed to be the first European to view the falls on November the 17th, 1855. From here we went to Bulawayo, our most southerly point. We did not continue on into South Africa because our objective was to survey road conditions in the less developed parts of the continent. Our next stop was the capital city of Salisbury, since renamed Harare. I had lived here briefly 2 years earlier. From here we continued north to Karoi, where I had worked as a mica miner in an area known for growing tobacco. We made a side trip to visit the still under construction Kariba Dam, which spanned the mighty Zambezi River, and crossed here into northern Rhodesia, since renamed Zambia. We turned northeast to Tanganyika and through the fields of sisal with its spear-like leaves. We had arrived in the coastal city of Mombasa in Kenya, where I had been living before leaving to come on this trip. Mombasa has a beautiful harbour perfect for sailing, except for the occasional shark. I renewed my contacts at the yacht club and with my friends on shore. Sadly, Rex had to leave us here, and Colin and myself continued on, passing the misty 20,000-foot-high Mount Kilimanjaro on our way to Nairobi, where we visited the game park. The buffalo is considered by many to be Africa's most dangerous animal. We continued past the jagged peaks of Mount Kenya, which I had previously climbed to over 16,000 feet. We recrossed the equator at the town of Nanyuki, 6,300 feet above sea level. Here we visited my father for a few days, before continuing our journey past Thompson's Falls. We climbed still higher past the Aberdare Mountains and Lake Nakuru. We more or less followed the line of the equator, reaching over 9,000 feet, where the roads were cold, rain-slicked and slippery. Our final crossing of the equator was in Uganda, before we reached the Queen Elizabeth National Park and camped on the shores of Lake Edward, where hippos browsed around the truck during the night. From here we retraced our route through the Congo, Central African Republic and Cameroon to Nigeria. We had planned to take a different route across the Sahara Desert and visit Timbuktu, but the Kano post office mislaid our permits. We crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and went to Granada, where we visited the Alhambra Palace, built by the Moors in the mid-14th century. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is the Court of the Lions. From here we went to Madrid. This impressive building is the central post office. We continued on into the Pyrenees to the small state of Andorra. We crossed the Port d'Envalira at 2,400 meters into France and headed along the Mediterranean coast to Monaco, and thence through the famous St. Bernard Pass into Switzerland, and finally across the English Channel to the White Cliffs of Dover.